Todos, bienvenidos a este tercer encuentro internacional en investigación en ciencias de la salud. La ciencia al alcance de todos. Es un placer enorme para mí introducir al doctor Aisa Abudegui, un gran amigo, compañero de ciencia. Y bueno, un pequeño resumen del doctor Abudegui es que él obtuvo su licenciatura en biología con distinción de honores por la Universidad Americana de Beirut. Obtuvo su doctorado en microbiología e inmunología, también con honores de la Universidad McGill en Montreal, Canadá. Y posteriormente él hizo 2 estancias postdoctorales, una en la Universidad de Oxford y otra en el Hospital Treviso en Italia. Y desde el 2013 regresó a su natal Jordania, en donde empezó a trabajar en el laboratorio de diagnóstico y ahora es el director. Además, también es profesor de tiempo parcial en la Facultad de Medicina, obviamente da las materias de inmunología en la Universidad de Jordania. Es autor de diversos artículos científicos, y capítulos del libro. Entonces, es un placer para mí tenerte con nosotros, Aisa. Thank you very much for being with us, and it's all yours. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, doctora Irazú. Es un placer. Muchas gracias a la Universidad Autónoma del Estado de México, a doctora Irazú y doctor José. Es un placer de estar aquí con vosotros en esta presentación. Yo voy a hablar a inglés porque no puedo dar todo en español, entonces espero que está bien con ustedes que vamos a darle esta presentación en inglés. So my name is Dr. Isa Abudegui, as Dr. Irazú has mentioned, and I will share with you instantly my presentation. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the efforts that we have put in my laboratory in Jordan during the COVID-19 pandemic to monitor the epidemiology of SARS-CoV-2 in Jordan. So I'll be speaking for about 30 minutes, and then I'll be happy to take your questions afterwards. So basically, just to confirm, can you see my screen? Can you see my presentation? Just want to make sure that you can see it. Yeah? Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay, so basically this project started when we applied for a grant with the Centers for Research in Emerging Infectious Diseases in the United States. And we got that grant, which gave us the money and the technical and scientific support to do COVID-19 surveillance in the country for a year. One moment, please. Yeah, so the project had 2 main aims. The first was to develop a SARS-CoV-2 surveillance system in Jordan. And with that, we wanted to sequence the genomes of 500 viruses at least, and perform an epidemiological analysis of these viruses. And the second was to develop a training platform for in-country NGS capacity, because at that time, there was no expertise, real expertise in Jordan to do next generation sequencing on viruses. And we wanted to learn that and teach that to a big number of people to be able to do that on our own in future pandemics and when the need arises. So what we did during this project, basically the workflow is as follows. We were collecting nasopharyngeal samples from patients, and then we were extracting RNA from those viruses. We're doing basically RT-PCR, turning this into DNA. Then we were selecting the samples that we wanted to sequence using certain criteria that we had at the time. Well, technically, then we did next generation sequencing, and then we inspected the data that we got out, and then we published all these sequences on the GISAID, which is a platform, an international platform to share where all the labs shared their sequence data. And then we use that to build next strain builds, epidemiological trees, and do advanced epidemiological analyses And we'll talk about this today. I will not go too much in details, but I'm happy to answer in more details in the question and answer period. So as you know, SARS-CoV-2 is a huge pandemic that put the world on hold. It put Jordan on hold, it put Mexico on hold, it put all the countries in the world on hold. And these are November statistics. You can see that up till end of November, 645 million got COVID-19, with more than 6.5 million deaths worldwide. In Jordan, it's a country of around 10 million, we had 1.7 million cases reported. And of course, these numbers are expected to be much higher than that. These are just the numbers that were detected and reported. Of course, we went into a variant story, and that was why next generation sequencing was so important, at the time, because it was enabling us to uncover these new variants. And you heard, of many variants during the COVID pandemic. And what's interesting is that they got famous for different reasons, right? For example, the Beta, or the South African variant, was famous because at the time it was able to evade the immune response. And therefore, we had issues with reinfections, with efficacy of vaccines, etc. While, for example, the variant Alpha here, or the British variant, B117, got famous because of its increased transmissibility. It was infecting more people, or people more readily, and that gave it the attention that it took. While, for example, Omicron had immune evasion as well as increased transmissibility features. So that's a timeline that shows our work that we did in the last 2 years during the pandemic. As you all remember, COVID-19 first case was reported in Wuhan, China in December 2019. And then soon after, in early March, the first case was detected in Jordan. A bit later, maybe a week later from the first case that was reported in Jordan by the government, BioLab, our laboratories, could identify in-house its first COVID-19 case. And then by the end of March, I started the communication with the Anderson Lab in the Scripps Institute in California to ask them whether they would be interested in a collaboration to study SARS-CoV-2 in the country. And a day later, Jordan declared a state of emergency nationally, where there was full travel restriction that took place in the whole country. So, travel was banned, basically, in addition to many other non-pharmaceutical interventions that took place. And then in April 2020, we managed to publish our first COVID-19 sequence in collaboration with the Scripps. And between April 2020 and February 2021, we were sending samples, so we're extracting RNA samples and then sending those to USA, where the Anderson Lab were doing the sequencing at the time. And we managed during that time to sequence 579 viruses from the country, including reporting the first British variant, or Alpha variant, or B117 in Jordan. Now, during that time, we realized, the Americans were getting very, very busy doing sequencing for other states as well as neighboring countries, including Mexico, by the way. And that drove us to start trying to do sequencing in-house and independently in our lab. And in fact, in February, we managed to publish the first sequence using next generation sequencing in our lab. And between the period of February and May, we produced from our lab 39 sequences, but they were important sequences because we were fishing for interesting samples that suggested new variants. And in fact, we were able to be the first people in the country to report the first Brazilian variant, first South African variant, in addition to the first B617.1, which is the Kappa variant, as well as the 617.2, which was the Indian variant or the Delta variant. So this was very important in reporting to the government and in letting them know what was going on. The CREED award that I told you about started in June 2021. And between June 21 and June 2022, we used that money and support to sequence close to 500 new sequences. It's very interesting to see that systemic sequencing by other national labs in the country started in September 2021. So almost a year and a half after we started. So for a year and a half, almost, we were the only lab that was systematically putting in sequences on GIS8. and the award ended in June 2022. And as of the end of November 2022, there is 1,365 Jordan sequences on GISAID. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story that we studied with those 579 sequences that we produced with the Scripps Institute in the United States, which happened between April 2020 and February 2021, which led us to publish a report in the Virological Forum in February 2021 that you see here, and ultimately led us to publish a Nature Communications paper on whom I'm a co-last author with Professor Christian Anderson from the United States, from the Scripps Institute. So I'll be telling you a little bit about what we found in that paper. So why was Jordan a good model to study in the first place? Why did we choose Jordan as a model? There were three main reasons that made us do so. First, if we look at the number of overall sequencing that was happening during that time period, we could find that Jordan was relatively well sequenced at the time. In fact, only Qatar and Israel had managed to sequence more than 1% of their sequences at the time. So Jordan was relatively well sequenced. Also, we had access to full travel data, including air travel and land travel into and out of Jordan. And that was very valuable for us to understand the epidemiology of the virus. And thirdly, Jordan is regionally connected. So for those of you who don't know where Jordan, Jordania is, that's the country over here. It's a small country of 10 million, right? But as you can see, it's right in the middle of the Middle East, spanning this part of the Arab Peninsula and Asia, as well as that stretch of North Africa. And therefore, the country is very regionally connected and is an important model to study in the context of epidemics. Now, we were producing a lot of phylogenetic work, and one of the main things that usually are produced in phylogenetics are these phylogenetic trees, or what we call evolutionary trees that basically show the evolutionary relationship between viruses. So, for example, if you look at such a tree, you can see that there's an ancestor virus, then there's a branch, it's another virus, then this branches, gives a virus in USA, a virus in Jordan. So each one of those is actually a virus, and each node is an ancestor virus. And the branch length here indicates genetic distance. So when we say, for example, this length, this distance means 0.002, this means that from every 2,000 nucleotides between this, for example, Saudi Arabian virus and its ancestor, there is 2 nucleotides that are different. That's what this means. Now, this is all useful and good, but sometimes this could be affected by some factors, including lack of variability, for example. And to solve this, we resolved to what we call time-focused trees. So instead of using genetic distance for these branches, we use time. So now, if you look at this tree, now this is no longer a maximum likelihood tree. This is called a time-focused or Bayesian tree. Now, what we're seeing is viruses, right? But we are showing them in the context of time rather than genetic difference. So here we can see that with time, for example, here we had an ancestral virus in the USA, which gave rise to another virus that we detected in the USA and a virus that we found in Jordan. Now, if we go one step back, let's say, okay, look at this virus from the USA. We just saw the ancestor. Let's look at its ancestor. For example, we can analyze that, and then we can find out. And of course, when we do that not once, not twice. We do that using many viral sequences and more than 10,000 times. So these are 10,000 trees that are summarized into one tree. And it shows here that, so it's a possibility tree, right? It shows what are the likelihoods. So it shows here that the likelihood of this ancestor is mostly also coming from USA. So a virus from USA gave rise to another virus from the USA at a later time, and then to another virus from USA and another virus in Jordan. If we look at this, for example, we have a virus in Saudi Arabia, a virus in Jordan around the same time. We see that their ancestor, for example, comes from Saudi Arabia. If we go one step back, we also see that the ancestor is also in Saudi Arabia. Going one step back, for example, here we can find that there's mixed data suggesting that this virus could have come 50-50 from either Saudi Arabia or USA. So that's what I talk about, these data and time-resolved trees being a subject of calculations and of probability. Now, what's important to note here is this jump here. You see, when we say that there was an ancestor virus in Jordan, and all of a sudden that virus gave rise to a virus in Jordan, we call this, in the world of epidemiology, an introduction. So this is a viral introduction from USA into Jordan. This is another introduction to Jordan, right? Coming from Saudi Arabia this time. And now we're talking, in this case, we say we have two independent introductions from USA and Saudi Arabia into Jordan. Those introductions in the world or the science of epidemiology are called Markov jump. So if I say Markov jump, then I'm saying that is an independent introduction from one country into a country that is under study. And in this case, it's Jordan. So one of the things that we published in this paper was a time-resolved tree using the exact same technique that I just explained to you. So this tree is a time-resolved tree. In green here, you can see all the green dots are viruses in Jordan. All the other colors are viruses coming from other places. So clearly you can see that in the beginning we had, if you look at all the little greens, we had different viruses coming from different sources, a lot of lineages, a lot of introductions from random different places. But then eventually you can see that we get two clades here, two clusters of viruses that were dominating in September. The bigger of which is B11312, and the smaller one is B136110. Remember this B11312 cluster because we're going to come back to that a bit later. So that summarizes what I just showed you in that tree. If we look before September 2020, these are the different lineages. So each color represents a different lineage of the virus. And you can see that before September, we have so many different colors. So that suggests so many different viruses from so many different places. And yet, if we look, this was the number of cases reported in the country. Because Jordan in March until September had strong full travel restrictions, we had very, very few cases happening. So although we had a lot of different lineages and introductions, there were not a lot of cases. As you can see, maximum 30 or 40 cases a day during that time. But when these full restrictions stopped and those non-pharmaceutical interventions that the government introduced were put down, were slowed down, Jordan went into its first wave that you see here and you see here. And you can see that now there are only mainly two colors. The majority is the B11312, which I told you about, and the other one was the B13610. And then Jordan tightened those measures. So the wave went down. And then by the end of the year, in around December 2020, we had to relax them again. Once we relaxed them again, we got our second wave, which was mainly driven by B117, which is the British variant, coming from Europe, which had high cases at the time. So remember this B11312. The reason I say that is because we found an interesting mutation in that virus, in the spike protein, in the S2 domain, and the mutation was called Q957L. This mutation was interesting because it was found in a heptad repeat region, a region that was previously in SARS-1, was shown to be involved in viral fusion. So we're all wondering, could this mutation explain why this virus is taking over, during that time? Or was this a stochastic or a random or a founder's effect? In fact, in collaboration with our colleague, Dr. Marceline Coté in the University of Ottawa, we performed a series of experiments where we measured the infectivity and the fusion of viruses that had this Q957 mutation and viruses that did not have. And I will not go into the details of this experiment, but what it does show here, if you compare this, no mutation with mutation, and also here with here, we can find that there was no advantage for this virus, neither in infectivity nor in fusion, suggesting that its presence was mostly due to stochastic or founder's effect, and that as soon as we lowered those travel restrictions and allowed other viruses to compete, the B117 took place. So talking about introductions, how did these viruses enter the country, and what was these dynamics of viral introduction to Jordan? we can see here that prior to the travel restrictions, these are Markov jumps, right? So as I said, these are introductions into the country. There was a big number of introduction, mostly coming from Europe, which had high cases at the time, right? Also, but not a lot of cases in Jordan because there were travel restrictions and a lot of other restrictions. The schools were closed, public events were banned, etc., etc. And then we can see that when the full travel restrictions went down, the number of introductions to the country went down, obviously, because we closed our borders. And now there's more community transmission. And also, we find that now there's less introductions from Europe and more introductions from this dark navy blue, which is the Middle East. Now, this is a different way of showing this because this is numerical and it's not very accurate because obviously we're just sequencing a very small fraction of the number of cases in the country. But if we look at this, this is a density plot, right? So it shows the density of introductions using different sampling techniques. And I don't have time to explain the difference between these sampling techniques, but it also shows that before the travel restrictions, a lot of introductions from Europe, a little bit from North America in yellow. Now, during travel restrictions, we switch from global introduction into regional introduction, where this navy blue, which is Middle Eastern countries, playing a more significant role in introductions into the country, and that when these travel restrictions end, we're back to more introductions from Europe and North America. Now, this is all sample restricted. I'm restricted in the number of samples that I have. So to see whether this is true, we wanted sample independent way of showing that. And this is where travel data becomes valuable. So now here we decided to look at air travel data and land travel data in the country and see what was happening in terms of travel patterns. And as you can see, this line here shows how many people are coming from the Middle East versus other places. And you can see that before travel restrictions, there were people coming from the Middle East, but there was also a good number of people coming from Europe, North America, and other places. When these travel restrictions happened, air travel switched mostly to Middle East, as you can see. And when we look at land travel, which is, of course, Middle East, because the country is in the Middle East, and land travel is with bordering countries, it was very interesting to see that during travel restriction periods, cars and buses stopped coming into the country. But trucks, commerce trucks, freight were still there. So you can see that although there was a small drop in April and May in the number of trucks coming to the country, they soon after went back to pre-pandemic levels. So just because Jordan is regionally connected does not mean that there's going to be more introductions from the Middle East. So in order to assess that, we created what is called an importation intensity index. What is an importation intensity index? What it is basically us studying the number of cases of COVID-19, asymptomatic cases that we assess in all the countries, and multiply those by the number of travelers from this country into Jordan. So now we're not only looking at countries that have a lot of COVID, and we're assuming that they will bring this to the country. We're looking at countries that had more cases of COVID and also more travelers coming into Jordan, and that gave us a more accurate understanding of the possibility of these viruses to be imported into the country. And we did this, or we calculated this index globally and for the Middle East. And as you can see, the data that we got is very consistent with what we saw with land travel and with our sequencing data, whereby Europe and North America had the biggest share of introductions or had higher importation intensity before the travel restrictions. But during travel restrictions, the global introductions or importation intensity went down drastically, while that of the Middle East and the regional countries went up. In fact, we looked at those regional countries that had the highest scores of importation index, which were Iraq, Israel, Palestine, and Saudi Arabia, and wanted to see, okay, these countries, they have the highest chance of bringing the virus into the country, but is it happening through air or through land? And as you can see, air is in black, land, specifically trucks, are in light blue. And you can see that in all of these countries, the majority of introduction or importation index that was calculated came from land travel, in particular trucks. And this is very consistent with the travel data that I just showed you, whereby it was trucks that were mainly involved in bringing in the virus to the country during travel restriction period rather than cars and buses, right? And then we found similar results when looked at exportation risks. So not only did we look at importation and how the virus came into the country, but we also wanted to study how did we export those viruses and to which countries, the ones in Jordan. So now we're looking at air travel outside, so from Jordan to other countries, land travel from Jordan to other countries. And you could also see a similar trend whereby during travel restrictions, we have a shift from a mixed Europe, North America, Middle East travel to an almost exclusive Middle East outbound air travel. Similar story with land travel. We could see that although buses and cars, there were not a lot of buses and cars coming out of the country, but a lot of trucks were still going out of the country to the other countries. And if we calculate an export intensity index, I talked about the importation intensity index. Now we talk about an exportation intensity index that we use a similar approach to calculate. We can see that the global exportation index is quite low. Now we're looking, of course, after travel restrictions, because this is when we opened our borders and started exporting viruses. But we find a big contribution of exporting viruses to Middle Eastern countries, mostly Iraq, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and that most of it was also happening in the forms of land travel and trucks. So, in summary, I hope that I managed to show you that there was dynamism of introduction sources in Jordan during 2020, where global and international travel played an important role before travel restrictions were in place. And then we switched into regional and community transmission. And then after that stopped, we went back more into global transmission. Also, I hope I've managed to show you that regional connectivity, and in particular land travel and freight transport, drove introduction risk during travel restrictions and export risk soon after, which basically leads me to an important public health message, and that is that air and land borders need to be equally and immediately monitored and controlled for an effective travel restriction policy. So it's not good enough to shut the airports and say no planes to come in and out without paying attention to our land borders. And it's also not enough to close the land borders and say, oh, it's okay, I'll let planes come in. They both need to be simultaneously monitored and controlled for an effective restriction policy. Also, I hope I managed to show you that we, in this paper, one of the important things that we've done is that we have effectively used epidemiological data and travel data to verify scarce genomic data. Because not all of the countries in the world were able to sequence a lot of viruses, right? So few countries could sequence 5% of their cases, for example. The majority of low to middle income countries were very late in sequencing and had very few genomic data. And that created a big problem for epidemiologists. It's very difficult to make a lot of accurate conclusions based on scarce genomic data. So what we did to go around and solve this problem was to use epidemiological data and travel data to verify and to support our genomic findings. So this approach not only would work for Jordan, but for any country that is found in a similar situation. In the end, I'd like to acknowledge a lot of people that put a huge effort in this work. From Biolab Jordan, a big team worked on that. The IT team had a big role in helping us obtain this data. HR team that allowed a lot of people to leave part of their previous work and do some research work with me, and of course the CEO of the company and of the labs, Dr. Hamid, from Thermo Fisher also, because our sequencer was a Thermo Fisher sequencer, so we had strong support from them throughout the sequencing process. And from the Anderson lab, a huge team worked on that. In particular, Dr. Edith Parker, Kathleen Anderson, and Dr. Mart Zeller, they did the sequencing of the initial viruses that we sent to the US. And a lot of these people also helped with the bioinformatic part And of course, last but not least, Professor Christian Andersen, who's the head of the Andersen Lab, who gave us the opportunity to start this very valuable collaboration and eventually get the grant and continue doing the work that we did and publish what we managed to publish. This is a picture of the heroes in Jordan, the team that did that project that I talked about today. This is basically the team in the molecular department. We have Ahmad here, and we have also Badia, we have Lama, and we have Shaima, and all these ladies and guys put a huge effort during the last 2 years doing sequencing, doing bioinformatics, and publishing all these sequences and analyzing them for us to reach the data that we managed to reach. So with this, I will conclude my talk. I thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining us this morning. It was an amazing chat. I think that it's truly a different approaching of this virus that had us all crazy all over the world. I truly never heard that point of view before, and I think it was really enriching for me and for all of the people who joined us this morning. I hope that it was as pleasant as it was for us to hear you. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And I hope that in the future we can have you here with us again.
Great
Now,
pleasure.
I'm going to see if we have some questions right here. No, I think it was all clear. Thank you so much again. And I hope we have this opportunity again in the future, and have a lovely day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa.
Sorry, Doctor.